They didn't even look at me when I hit the floor. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the cold tile, not the ringing in my ears, not the way my shoulder felt like it had been separated from the rest of my body. It's that my son just stood there, holding his champagne glass, and his wife turned to her mother and said something I couldn't hear, and they both laughed. I lay there for what felt like a long time. Nobody came. Let me back up, because you're not going to understand any of this without the whole picture. And I think, after 63 years of being careful and quiet and not asking for much, I've earned the right to tell this story my way. My name is not important. What's important is that I am a retired man who lives in a modest house in Decatur, Georgia, drives a 10-year-old pickup truck, shops at the same Kroger I've shopped at since 1987, and until recently, my son believed I survived on Social Security and a small pension from the 30 years I spent working as a custodial supervisor for the DeKalb County school system. That last part is true, by the way. I did work for the county for 30 years. What my son never knew, what I never told anyone really, except for my attorney and my financial advisor, is that my father left me something when he died in 2009. My father was not a flashy man. He was a quiet man from rural Tennessee who bought land when land was cheap and held onto it longer than anyone thought he should. When he died, that land was worth considerably more than it was when he bought it. And then I held on to my share of it for another 12 years, while my son was busy being impressed by people with nice shoes and granite countertops. My son's name is Donovan. He's 34. He married a woman named Piper 3 years ago. Piper is the kind of person who corrects people's pronunciation at dinner parties and considers this a form of generosity. Her mother, Vivian, flew in from Scottsdale for the wedding and has been making my life a quiet misery ever since. I liked my son before he married Piper. I want to say that clearly. I liked the boy he was. He used to call me on Sunday mornings just to talk. He drove 3 hours to help me put in a new water heater the winter after his mother died. He cried at her funeral in that way men do, when they're not sure if they're allowed to cry, and I put my arm around him and told him it was fine. And he cried harder, and that was fine too. That Donovan, I don't know where he went. The Donovan who showed up after Piper started talking about building a life that reflects your values. That Donovan started talking differently. He started describing things as elevated or understated or thoughtfully curated. He started using the word aesthetic like it was a personality. And somewhere in all of that, the way he looked at me started to change. It was small things at first. He'd pick me up from my house and make a comment about the yard. Not a helpful comment. A comment that let me know he was embarrassed by the yard. His wife would ask what I'd been doing and I'd say I'd been at the VFW with some friends, and she'd do this smile that wasn't really a smile. The kind that says, without saying, that she has filed you away in a category, and the category is not one she respects. I let it go. Older men let things go. You learn to pick what matters. What I didn't see coming was the retirement party. Donovan called me in September to tell me he was being promoted to vice president of client relations at his company, a commercial real estate firm in Buckhead. He wanted to throw himself a party. He asked if I would come. I said of course. He gave me the date and the name of the venue, a rooftop event space in Midtown Atlanta, and then he said, almost as an afterthought, "Dad, it's going to be a pretty nice crowd. Business people. You might want to, I don't know, maybe wear something a little." He didn't finish the sentence. I told him I understood. I wore my good blazer. Navy, from Dillard's, bought for my wife's cousin's wedding in 2018. Clean shirt, pressed. I drove myself to the venue, paid for my own parking, took the elevator to the roof. The first thing I noticed was that my son did not come to greet me. The second thing I noticed was Vivian, standing with a group of women near the bar, who saw me, said something to the woman next to her, and then looked away. I found a spot near the edge of the terrace where I could see the skyline and stood there with a glass of club soda and tried not to feel what I was feeling. Donovan found me about 40 minutes in. He was already flushed from the open bar, and he had the energy of a man who was performing his own life for an audience. He introduced me to 2 of his colleagues. He said, "This is my father. He worked for the county school system." The way he said it, it was a disclaimer, a footnote. Something to be acknowledged and moved past quickly. One of the colleagues said, "Oh, wonderful. Education is so important." Donovan agreed that education was very important, and then he steered his colleagues away from me. I stood at the edge of that rooftop for another hour. I ate the past appetizers when they came around. I watched my son work the room. He was good at it. Actually, there was something painful about watching him be charming, because I recognized it as something he'd learned from me, some version of easy warmth that I used to have, and that he'd taken and polished into something I barely recognized. Piper came to find me around the time they were doing the formal toasts. She said, "I think it might be better if you headed home before the dinner portion. We only have seating for the professional guests." I looked at her. She said, "It's nothing personal. We just have a very specific evening planned. I want to tell you that I said something sharp and devastating. I want to tell you I held my ground. But the truth is I looked across the terrace at my son, who was laughing at something someone had said, and he didn't look back at me, and I understood that he knew this was happening and had let it happen, and something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. I put down my club soda. I took the elevator down. I sat in my truck in the parking garage for a little while before I could drive. I didn't call him that night. I didn't call him the next day either. On the third day, he called me, and his voice had the particular lightness of a man who has decided not to discuss something. He asked how I was doing. I said fine. He asked if I'd gotten home okay from the party. I said yes. He said great. And then he told me about a trip he and Piper were planning to Portugal, and I listened, and I said it sounded wonderful. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Lawrence. Lawrence is my attorney. He's been my attorney for 19 years, and before that he was my wife's attorney, which is how we found him. She'd used him to handle some family business before we were married, and she said he was the kind of man who told you what you needed to hear, and not what you wanted to hear. She was right. He has told me many things I didn't want to hear, and I have never once regretted listening. I told Lawrence what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which is something not everyone does. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How do you want to handle this?" I thought about it. I said, "I want to be methodical." He said, "Good. Come in Thursday." I also called my financial advisor, a woman named Roberta, who has managed my assets since 2014, and who has, on more than one occasion, used the phrase, "Your son is never going to know what hit him," in a purely financial planning context that I have always found mildly comforting. I told her what had happened. She was less quiet than Lawrence about it. She said several things I will not repeat here because they were not printable, and then she said, "What do you want to do?" I told her the same thing I'd told Lawrence. She said, "Okay, I know exactly where to start. Now, I have to explain something about the way my money is structured, because it matters to the rest of this story. When I inherited from my father, I didn't just put the money in a savings account. Lawrence helped me set up a series of LLCs and trusts, the kind of arrangement that keeps your name out of things. The money flows through entities with names that mean nothing to anyone looking at them from the outside. One of them is a property management company. One of them is an investment vehicle my father's accountant originally set up, and that we just continued. To anyone who looked at my finances, including my son, who had never once asked, I appeared to be a retired man living on about $1,500 a month. What I actually had was considerably more than that. The Property Management LLC, and this is the part that became relevant, owned a small portfolio of commercial properties in the Atlanta area. 3 of them, to be specific. Medium-sized office and retail spaces, well-maintained, fully leased. One of them was in Buckhead, Donovan's company, the commercial real estate firm, where he had just been promoted to vice president of client relations, leased its office space in a building that was managed by an LLC that I controlled. He didn't know. There was no reason he would have known. The property was managed through a third-party management company, and the ownership was layered in the way that Roberta and Lawrence had spent years carefully layering it. He didn't know, and that was fine, and I had never intended to do anything with that information. Until the night I sat in that parking garage. I want to say something here, because I know how this sounds. I know there are people who will read this and say I was being cruel, or petty, or that I should have simply talked to my son like an adult. And maybe they're right. But here's what I know. I had talked to my son. I had talked to my son in the patient, quiet way I had talked to him his whole life. And somewhere along the way, my son had decided that my voice was background noise, that I was someone to be managed, positioned, apologized for, that the category he'd filed me into, embarrassing father, public liability, was permanent and final. I decided it wasn't permanent. Roberta started making calls in October. The lease on the Buckhead property, Donovan's company's office, was up for renewal at the end of the year. Standard 5-year commercial lease. The third-party management company sent a letter to the tenant, which is to say to Donovan's company, informing them that the ownership group had decided not to renew at current terms. They could either renegotiate at a significantly higher rate or vacate by January 31st. Office space in Buckhead in the current market is not cheap. Finding comparable space on 2 months' notice is not easy. I did not know everything that happened inside that office after that letter arrived, but I know that there was a great deal of scrambling because Lawrence had a contact who knew people at the company, and word gets around. I know that Donovan was personally involved in trying to locate alternate space because it fell under his division. I know that the stress of it was considerable. I know because my son called me in November. He called on a Sunday morning, which is when he used to call me before Piper, and his voice didn't have that managed lightness in it anymore. He sounded tired. He asked how I was doing, and this time he waited for the actual answer. I told him I was doing all right. He said he'd been having a hard couple of months at work. I told him I was sorry to hear that. He said there was this property issue, this lease situation that was causing real problems, and he didn't know how it was going to shake out. I let him talk. At the end of the call, he said, "Dad, I've been meaning to say, I'm sorry about the party, the way Piper handled things, the way I let her handle things. You shouldn't have had to leave like that." I was quiet for a moment. He said, "Dad?" I said, "I heard you." He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know you do." And then I said, "I want to take you to lunch. Just us. Can you do that?" He said, "Yes." We went to a diner I've been going to since before he was born. On a Thursday afternoon in November, he ordered coffee. I ordered coffee and a piece of pie. We sat across from each other in a booth, and I looked at my son's face, and I could see, underneath the haircut and the business clothes, the boy who drove 3 hours to help me with a water heater. I told him I needed to show him something. I put a folder on the table. He opened it slowly. I watched his face as he read. The color changed. Then he looked up at me. Said, "Dad," I said, "I'm not angry with you. I want you to understand that first." He kept looking at me. I said, "But I need you to understand something. The man you brought to that party, the man you let your wife dismiss, the man you've been embarrassed by for the last 3 years, that man has been paying attention. And that man is asking you to pay attention too." He put the folder down. His hands weren't quite steady. I said, "I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because you need to know who I am. You stopped knowing who I was, and that hurt me more than I know how to tell you." He didn't say anything for a long time. The diner was quiet. Someone behind us was talking about the Braves. Then my son said, "I don't know who I've been lately." I said, "I know." He said, "I've been so worried about what people think, about what Piper thinks, about what her family thinks." I lost track of. He stopped. I said, "Of what matters?" He nodded. I picked up my coffee. I said, "The lease situation at your office is going to work out. Lawrence is already drafting the renewal at standard market rate. I made some calls." He stared at me. I said, "Consider it a gift." But gifts work both ways, Donovan. They require the person receiving them to understand what they're receiving. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I thought about the rooftop. I thought about the parking garage. I thought about my wife's face at our kitchen table the last morning I saw her. The way the light came through the window behind her head like something painted. I said, "I need you to come to Sunday dinner. I need your wife to come too. I need it to be the real version of things, not the managed version. Can you do that?" He said yes. I don't know yet if he means it the way I need him to mean it. I don't know if Piper will come and be genuine, or if she'll come and perform, or if she won't come at all. I've lived long enough to know that people are slow to change, and that love doesn't fix everything, and that sometimes the people you raise don't become who you hoped. But I also know this. Donovan called me last Sunday morning. He called to talk. Just to talk. He told me about a problem he was having at work, something small, and he asked what I thought. I told him. He listened. He laughed once at something I said in the way he used to laugh, unguarded, like he wasn't performing anything. When he hung up, he said, "Thanks, Dad." I sat with the phone in my hand for a minute. Then I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where my wife used to sit, and I watched the light come through the window, and I thought that sometimes the longest road back to someone is the one they have to find themselves, and the only thing you can do is leave the porch light on.